Hello, um, welcome. This is going to be a Dharma talk. It's Easter. Happy Easter, everybody. And as usual, it takes us a few minutes to get started because we have to invite people and people have to join in. So just be patient with me and we will get started just as soon as we can. Hey Jeremy, welcome. August, welcome. Again, we'll get started in just a moment. I want to give people a minute to sign in. Welcome, Aaron. This is going to be a Dharma talk again. I'm going to talk a little bit about some Christian teachings that I really like. Petra, welcome. It's good to see you. Glad you can make it. Welcome, Melissa. I know this isn't usually a good time for you, so I'm glad you could, today you could make it. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about some Christian teachings that I like, my interpretation. I once when I was in college, I went to a church service by a group, and they like to say that you shouldn't interpret scripture, and yet that's exactly what they were doing. So I don't think it's possible to not interpret scripture. That might be a very popular idea among some groups, but I think it's pretty much just impossible. How we each read or interpret or take something is going to be different. We might agree, but there's no way we can get it so everybody agrees. Hey Dad, welcome Nancy. It's good to see you all. All right, we'll give just another minute. I usually like to give people about 5 minutes before we get into the meat of it. So again, we'll talk a little bit about some Christian teachings, a little bit about Jesus, and then we will move into some other topics if we have time. Now, during this period, while I'm talking, if you have a question or if you can't hear me or you can't see me for some reason, let me know. Each week I'm trying to improve the quality of the videos a little bit. So this week I've got some new lights that were donated by one of our members who contributes a lot, actually, Matt McKenney. So many of you know him. He plays drums with me, and he noticed that my lighting was not that good, so he offered to purchase me a lighting kit, which came this week. So we're using that now. Hopefully that makes a little bit of a difference. And then I've got a microphone that I started using last week, and then I've got a different microphone that I'll be using for my live videos. So I'm just trying to make everything a little bit better quality so that the audio and visual stuff isn't a barrier to getting the message across. Some people can hear the message no matter how many barriers there are, but other people, it's hard for them to overcome things like that. It can make a difference. So I'm going to do everything I can to remove those barriers. Hey Sibley, welcome. Barb, good to see you. All right, so we've given people about 5 minutes. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe some people will join us as we go. So why don't we start by listening to the gong. Hopefully you can hear it. The microphone is here on my lapel, but I think there's enough bleed that you can probably hear it. So this is we're going to ring the gong 3 times, and that just represents the 3 treasures. Okay, so the Buddha, the teacher, the Dharma, the teaching, and the Sangha, the community, spiritual community, which is you. right, so again, welcome everyone who's just joining us. Amanda, KK, Shanta, Marissa, Mark. Sometimes people want to share these videos with others, so you can start a watch party. That might be a good way to do that if you're interested, if there's other people who you think might benefit from this. All right. If you want to contribute to help me keep offering these things free of charge, then there's some donation links up there that you can check out. So let's get into it. Happy Easter, first of all. So Easter is about the resurrection. So the story of Christ, which is a myth. And I'm interested in the story of Christ as a myth. I'm not really interested in debating whether or not, you know, the events of his life are factual or not. For me, that's not really that important. If it is to you, that's fine. You can debate that and you can believe whatever you like. But as a spiritual teacher, I'm interested in myth because myth is a very powerful tool for us in unlocking something that is inside of the human heart, the human psyche, the human mind, the human spirit. So one teacher that I studied with, he once said that a myth is a lie told in service of a greater truth. So if you look at Jesus, if you look at Buddha, there are all kinds of stories. There's a story that Buddha was born out of the side of his mother. He didn't come out of, you know, he didn't have a normal birth. And this is, again, the same theme as with Jesus. He was a virgin birth. The idea that these spiritual masters somehow, you know, they're not born in the way that normal people are born. Are those stories true? I'm going to say probably not. Again, if you want to believe they're true, that's fine. This is just my opinion. And what do I know? I'm a yoga teacher, right? I haven't been back in time, you know, I'm not an expert, but last time I heard virgins don't give birth and people don't come out of the side of their mother. Now again, the idea of this story of saying those things is to say these are extraordinary people. So right from their birth, we're supposed to believe that they're somehow different. They're somehow special. Okay? So again, the point isn't that it's a fact that it happened. Really the point is to make us begin to say, oh, wow, you know, something different is happening here. So a myth is a lie that's told in service of a greater truth. So we find that truth can occur on different levels. You know, there's facts and things like that. And in fact, I'm writing something right now that'll come out later in the week on the Patreon page about, you know, sort of facts versus truth and things of that nature. So there's a truth that is so profound that we can't speak about it. It really is beyond words. It is really beyond understanding in an intellectual sense. So we're not going to be able to break it apart and lay it out. Here's the truth. Facts we can do that with, but facts aren't necessarily the truth, right? A fact is just sort of like a little factoid. I'm holding, you know, a gong striker. That's a fact. But maybe someone else wants to say this isn't a gong striker anymore. So, you know, again, even there we can start to run into all kinds of issues. And again, this goes back to my point earlier about interpretation. We find that people can believe whatever they want to believe. It doesn't necessarily make it true. Doesn't necessarily make it helpful. So again, what are we doing with our thoughts? It's a very important question for us. So anyway, my interest in Jesus and the story of Jesus is really mythological in nature. And I also am very interested in Jesus as a spiritual teacher, because I think he was a very powerful teacher. And I think, you know, he was a real man. I really do think he taught or not. But I was talking with someone earlier today, and they were saying how actually in numerology, there's a theory that, you know, Jesus was never crucified. That's all a numerological myth. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not saying he was or wasn't. I'm just saying that, again, a myth serves a greater purpose. So when an individual becomes mythologized, they no longer belong to their own historical life anymore, right? Now their story is serving something greater. It's serving spirit, it's serving God, it's serving divinity. And in that way, it doesn't really matter whether something was factual or not, okay? And I know that might not make sense right away, but that's really the way myths work. It's what is it unlocking in our psyche and in our heart? So Easter is about the resurrection. And the resurrection spiritually is an interesting idea because it speaks to this idea of being born again. We all have a physical birth. Our mother gives us that, or our parents give us that. But most people don't have a spiritual birth. And this is represented in the yogic tradition by what's called a twice born. And if you notice in our own Western culture, it's very similar to born again. Right? In Christianity, there's this idea of being born again. And the idea is that, we all have a physical birth, but not everyone has this spiritual birth. Not everyone is born again or born anew or comes back or is resurrected. So this idea of resurrection, of being born again, of coming back, dying to our old self and then being resurrected. And this is why in a spiritual tradition you might take on a new name, because the idea is that you've actually died to your old self and now you are a new being. Even though the body is the same, there's a new being or new consciousness inhabiting this body. So there are a few teachings that I really gravitate to of Jesus's. And I'm by no means a scholar or an expert or anything like this. So you just have to take all of this as this is just my relationship with, again, Jesus's teaching. I think he was a great spiritual teacher. I also think personally he's one of the most misunderstood spiritual teachers, maybe of all time. I think that his teaching is distorted, it's perverted, it's made to justify things that are just the opposite of what Jesus was actually trying to teach. And I think he taught a lot. And he didn't have a lot of time to do it in, but I think his teaching is very, very powerful, very influential. So we'll just look at a few things, kind of 4 things that I really like from his teaching. So the first one is going to be forgiveness, okay? And I think this is absolutely key, and it's a very important part of my own teaching. And it doesn't come entirely from Jesus, but he's a big influence on me in that regard. So forgiving. And I want to be very clear, we forgive not for the other's sake, right? We might think, well, so-and-so really, did a number on me, but because I'm so spiritual, I'll forgive them. Wow, I'm so saintly. Look at me, I'm forgiving you. You're really a jerk, but because I'm so big, I'm going to forgive you. This is absolutely the wrong attitude to have when it comes to forgiveness. We forgive for our own sake. We forgive because of what it does for our own psyche, for our heart, and for our mind. It frees us of a burden and poison that we would have otherwise. The other person may never know that we even forgive them. They might not even know that we were mad at them. Have you ever had that? Where you had somebody who, they did something to you. And maybe one day you talk to them and you find out they didn't even know you were mad. They didn't even know that they had done anything to upset you. Okay? So forgiveness is for us. It's not for the other. It's 100% for us. And trust me, it works. Jesus knew what he was talking about. If you forgive, no matter how egregious the sin, no matter how egregious the wrong that you think it is, if you can find the place to forgive, then you are set free. Doesn't matter. It's not for the other person. Who cares about them? You're trying to set yourself free, and that's what's important. So forgiveness does that for you. And a very powerful teaching that, again, comes from the Christian tradition by way of A Course in Miracles. And I consider that part of the tradition. If you don't, that's fine. But for me, it's very much an important part of it. And one of the things that comes from that teaching is that really there's nothing to forgive. Now, I don't have time to expound on that teaching. If you want to learn more about it, go check out A Course in Miracles, start studying it. It is something you can study for the rest of your life. It's a massive scripture, a modern scripture that's come to us. And again, it comes to us via the Christian tradition. Very, very powerful. And there's so many powerful lessons to learn there. But one of them is that there really is nothing to be forgiven ultimately. And again, I know some of you are thinking, what is he talking about? You know, my mother did this, my father did that, my ex did this and that, this person, you know, did these horrible things to me, my boss, my children. I've been wronged so many times. Yes, that is the work to eventually get to that point where we realize that all of those wrongs were essentially misunderstanding. It's essentially confusion, what in yoga is called avidya. So all of these traditions, they can speak to one another if you know how to speak their language. They're pointing to the same things, and depending on what part of the country or what part of the world they came from, when, what time they were coming along, they have a different inflection, they emphasize different points. But for me, they're really all pointing in the same direction. So that first one, forgiveness, for me, huge. And again, if you want to set yourself free, learn to forgive. And when are you really done forgiving? When you no longer see that there's anything to be forgiven. Okay, that's really when your work is done. As long as you're still thinking, well, you know, they did that, but I'm just going to let that go because I'm so big, you know, that's not forgiveness. So this is what a lot of people think forgiveness is. And this isn't what we're talking about here. Okay, so first one that I really like is forgiveness. All right, the next one is non-judgment. And this is really an important one, and it kind of goes along with the forgiveness thing. So if I don't really understand the full picture, and who does, right? We don't have perfect information as human beings. I hope you realize that. I hope you listening realize that you have been mistaken in the past, right? You maybe heard something and that wasn't what was actually said. Or maybe you saw something and then you realize, ooh, I was mistaken. Okay, maybe you remember something incorrectly and then someone corrects you and you're like, oh, whoops. We tend to forget these things, don't we? But if we are really honest with ourselves, we can find instances where, yes, we have been mistaken, we have been wrong. Now, what's interesting about scientific research is it basically shows us that this is very true for us all the time. We remember things incorrectly all the time. We make misjudgments, misperceptions all the time. This is science. This isn't my opinion. So maybe you think you're just better than everyone else, and you don't. You're the one exception to the rule. But I think that's a dangerous place to be, especially if you're a spiritual seeker. I think it's much better to assume that you're average or maybe even below average. Okay? So we all misjudge. We all misperceive. We don't have all the facts, right? So when we're saying, I know that person was trying to belittle me with that comment, I just know it. Do we really actually know that? Well, I just have a feeling. Well, you've had a feeling before and it's been wrong, haven't you? And again, you have to be really honest with yourself to do this work. This work isn't for someone who wants to BS themselves, because that's all you're doing is BSing yourself. This is about being honest with yourself, right? I can't hear your answer. I don't know what you're saying over there. This is for people who really want the truth. And the truth on one level may not be very pretty. So we have to be willing to admit these things to ourselves in order to go to the next step. And then eventually the truth sets us free. All right, but at first it might feel like, oh my God, this truth thing is too much for me to bear. I don't want it. I'm not interested. Okay? So non-judgment, our information is limited. It's distorted. This is just part of the package of being human. So we really are not in a place to judge. If there is a judge, there's only one, and that judge would be God. He or she or it, however you want to refer to it, that being can judge us because that being has all the information. Now, I'm not talking in a practical sense, okay? In terms of like, do we need to put this person in prison, or do we need to, send this person to rehab or whatever? Those are just practical. Those are practical things. We can decide those things without malice, hatred, and judgment in our heart and our mind. That's what people don't understand. They often think we can only be motivated by some kind of negative or positive emotion. That if I'm not angry with someone, I'm not going to, say, incarcerate them. Well, I can incarcerate someone with compassion. Right? Why do I have to incarcerate someone because I'm angry at them? Maybe I can incarcerate someone for their own good and for the greater good, and the whole time be feeling compassion and love for them. Why not? Does it have to be hatred? Does it have to be vengeance? I'm going to say no, it doesn't. Okay? So the one thing I forgot to say about forgiveness is if we really practice forgiveness, it leads us to a sense of peace. Okay? We get a sense of peace. Now, non-judgment, again, our information is limited, so really only God, if there is a God, however you want to conceive of God, divinity, they are the one that can judge. And again, according to the Course, God loves His children. His children are perfect. So it is our confusion, it is our misunderstanding if we're seeing something different. And again, on the surface, that's going to be a very hard nut to swallow. So this isn't something to take lightly. Again, the Course is a huge book, and it is a lifetime of study. So don't just take these things that I'm saying and then say, oh, that's bullshit. You need to dig deeper into it if you're going to understand these statements. All right, so the next teaching I like from Jesus is the teaching about innocence. And these are all tied in, right? How can I really judge if I don't know? Forgiveness also. It's easy to forgive when I really don't understand what's going on. And then innocence, what do I really know? Now, those of you who've been following my teaching for a while know that I'm a huge fan of Socrates, who was a philosopher and enlightened master. Like Jesus, he's another one of my favorite Western teachers. And one of my favorite teachings that comes from Socrates is he would say, as for me, I know that I know nothing. And this is the person who's considered the wisest man in Athens in his day. And if people said, what do you know, Socrates? What's going on? What's important? What should I learn? He used to say his teaching was to teach you that you also knew nothing. You didn't know what you thought you knew. Okay, so he'd say, as for me, I know that I know nothing, and the whole thrust of my teaching is to show you that you know nothing. Now, why would he do that? That sounds like a waste of time. Well, innocence. When we don't know anything, we are innocent. What did Jesus tell us about innocence? Well, we must be innocent to enter the kingdom of heaven, or our Father's kingdom. All right. Now, again, this is a spiritual teaching. And innocence isn't the same thing as stupidity. Okay. being childlike is not the same thing as being childish. So this is a letting go of a rigidity and a hardness that can happen in the mind, a sort of calcification of our thoughts and our beliefs and our ideas. And with spiritual teaching or philosophical teaching, in the case of Socrates, we can begin to dissolve this calcification, this hardening of our beliefs and our ideas and our rigidity around right and wrong. And what we think we know, what we think is a fact, what we think is true and not true. And then that allows the mind to function in a different way, in a much more efficient and a much more pleasant way. It's a much more enjoyable way to go through life. Life really takes on a pleasure that isn't there when we are in that calcified, solidified mental state, when our beliefs and ideas are so rigid and hard. So again, these teachings are for our own good. We become innocent because it serves us. Okay, it's not a moral teaching. It's not you're a bad person if you are not innocent, right? This is how spiritual teaching is often misunderstood or mistaken. It's taken as a moral, ethical, thing, like forgive because if you don't, you're a bad person. That's not what I'm saying anyway. Okay, and I don't think that's what Jesus was saying. I'm saying forgive for your own good. Forgive so you can be happy. Forgive so you can be free. Forgive so you can be at peace. Okay? Don't judge. Not because, you're helping someone else out by doing that, because you're helping yourself. Okay? Now, it so happens that spiritually speaking, when we help others, we're also helping ourselves. And when we're truly helping ourselves, not helping our ego, which is a different thing, right? Our ego might want money and fame and to gratify the senses. That's a different thing, okay? So I'm not saying help yourself in that way. How do we really help ourselves? These teachings, forgiveness, innocence, non-judgment, right? So when we're really helping ourselves, we're also helping others. And then in that sense, when we're helping others in that way, through forgiveness, through non-judgment, then we are helping ourselves. Okay, so knowing that we really don't know anything for sure, and again, that may not be obvious right away, but if you study some philosophy, if you study these teachings, and you very often figure out, if you meditate for a while, you really start to figure out, like, maybe I don't know what I thought I knew. Maybe things are not so clear as I like to believe they are. And then in a strange sense, things become more clear, but in a different way. A different capacity is unlocked in our consciousness, or is freed in our consciousness, that begins to function, that is superior to the one that we were using before. Okay? And this just has to be experienced. It's not something that, I can show you or explain other than that. It just has to be experienced. And this is why spiritual practice just has to be done. There's only so much someone can explain to you. A lot of my teaching is about trying to inspire you to do the work. And then you verify these things I'm saying for yourself. There really is no other way to verify them. So when we really succeed with innocence, this leads to a sense of wonder. Maybe you even remember being a child, in that sense of childlike wonder and awe. How amazing life is. Do you really think this moment is really any different than those moments when you were a child and you were just in awe? Do you really think anything has changed? Or do you think maybe your capacity to experience awe has... It's not that awe isn't there. It's not that that wonder isn't still there. But our capacity to experience it has been cut off. We've closed our heart. We've closed our mind. We've walled ourselves off to protect ourselves, right? So we can be in control, so we can understand, so we can predict. But now there's no more sense of wonder. Now it's like we know everything. Pandemic sucks, this sucks, that sucks. This person's trying to belittle me. This person's trying to take my job. Those people are out to get me. This political party is of the devil. These people are, unawake, unenlightened, sinners, however we want to put it. Well, maybe we don't really know what's going on. And with that sense of innocence and wonder, we begin to experience every moment and every person on a deeper, mysterious level that really, again, has a deeper truth to it. It's not to say that on the surface level we're not right with all those judgments, right? Yeah, people embezzle money. People will try and cheat you. On a surface level, it's not denying anything on the surface level. But again, folks, I have to emphasize spiritual teaching is not about the surface level. If that's all your spiritual teachers are talking about, then it's not really spiritual teaching. If they're just talking about how you become successful, how you make your dreams come true, how you manifest this and that, that's not spirituality. Okay, I don't know what that is, manifestology or something like that. It might be non-physical in the sense that you're maybe using mental activity to try and manifest something physically, but mental activity is actually physical too. So I'm not even going to go so far as to say that it's not physical. Okay? So again, we need to be clear on these things. And I'm not trying to put anything down. I'm not trying to put Tony Robbins or whoever likes, if you've got a vision board, great, manifest. There's nothing wrong with it. But manifesting stuff really has nothing to do with ultimately our spiritual journey. Okay, so innocence. This leads to a sense of wonder. And then humility. Humility. What is this about? For me, it's really the recognition of our inherent imperfection as human beings. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. I think that our imperfections is what makes us beautiful. The Japanese have a tradition of when a piece of pottery breaks, they will very often glue it back together with gold speckled paint, gold dust speckled paint. And so then when it gets put back together, there's this beautiful, just depending on how it shattered, there's these beautiful lines that are, gold lines that are these cracks that are all down the side. And, the idea is that breaking, that imperfection is actually beautiful. Maybe the piece is even more beautiful now that it's been pasted back together. Another form that this takes from the Eastern traditions is the lotus flower. I don't know if you might have heard that the lotus flower is a symbol that's used in Eastern traditions. Why the lotus? Have you ever wondered, is it just because, it's a beautiful flower? Well, why not a rose then? Why a lotus specifically? So I don't know if you know this, but a lotus grows in the mud at the bottom of a pond, in the scum, pond scum, basically. That's where the roots of the lotus is. Doesn't get much more nasty than that. You don't really want to put your feet in there. There are probably slugs and all kinds of, bloodsuckers, things like that down there. You don't want your feet in there. But then the lotus grows up through the water and it comes to the surface where it blossoms and opens into this beautiful, pristine, perfect flower. And the flower doesn't display any of the mud from which it came up. So what is this symbolizing for us? Well, I think very often when we get on a spiritual path, we somehow think that we need to rid ourselves of our humanity. We need to rid ourselves of our imperfections. We somehow have to become more than human. And I think that this is a huge mistake, especially if we're coming at it in the wrong way, which is what most people do. What most people do is they take their ego and they give their ego the job of turning themselves into spiritual beings. And that's going to get you nowhere fast. Because if we're really on a spiritual path, we are trying to slowly dissolve and dismantle the ego. So it doesn't matter if we give the ego a spiritual job, it's still going to reinforce the ego. So telling it, hey, here's what it means to be perfect and to be spiritual, and then to see ourselves, well, we're going to fall short. I don't care who you are. If you don't think you fall short of spiritual ideals, then my guess is you're not being very honest or realistic with yourself. Generally, with self-awareness comes sometimes the shock and the disgust and the disappointment of actually seeing what is going on in our heart and our mind. And it can be absolutely terrifying. And this is one of the reasons why I often say that compassion starts with us. Because when I go into my meditation and I see the things about my own character that I don't approve of, that I don't like, thoughts that come up about other people, judgments, I'm like, my God, I know they're not true. I don't believe them for a second, and yet still the mind is producing them. Or the heart is feeling them. It's easy to get disgusted. It's easy to be like, what the heck is wrong with me? Am I a bad person? And so this really humbles us. And I think that that's a very good thing, that we be humble. And in that humility and imperfection, it becomes so much easier to forgive others, to not judge others, again, to practice the innocence I was talking about, because you're like, well, what do I really know? And that puts us in a great place, spiritually speaking. So admitting our own perfection, seeing the muck, right? If we can see that muck in our own unconscious. Water generally represents in spirituality the unconscious, okay? Like a body of water. So down in the unconscious is all that muck and grossness, right? All the things about ourselves that we never wanted to see or know about ourselves, right? And then we go into meditation, we're going into the water, and we're like, oh my God, gross, disgusting. I'm disgusted with myself. Well, through our spiritual work, the lotus begins to grow. And then from that willingness to face that muck, that disgustingness at the bottom of the water, something beautiful can grow. And the lotus represents enlightenment, right? So what is that teaching telling us? Well, we need to be willing to see those shadow sides of ourselves, the darkness in our heart and our mind, as long as we're hiding that from ourselves, right? Because we're trying to be good. No. Doug's wrong. I'm a good person. Not saying you're not a good person. But again, these thoughts, these feelings generally are just part of the human condition. I'm not saying we all have them in the same capacity or at the same time. I'm not saying that over time it doesn't change. But what's interesting in my experience is it doesn't change just because we want it to. And this is a huge lesson for us to learn on a spiritual path. That just because I see something about my character that I don't approve of or I don't like, it doesn't mean it's going to go away. Especially right away. And this is where grace can come in. This is what recovery programs in AA are all about. They understand this. That there are things that we are powerless to change. And again, if we're practicing non-judgment, forgiveness, innocence. Maybe they aren't supposed to change. Have you ever considered that? Think of your worst quality, the thing about yourself that you most want to change. And again, if you don't have something, then you probably haven't dug that deep yet. I'm not saying that makes you a bad person, but I'm going to encourage you, do some work. Dig in there. Find out what's going on. Don't be afraid, right? That's one of the reasons we don't do this, is because we're terrified to see. But it's always better to know than not to know, right? If there's some shadow or some demon lurking down in my subconscious, I want to know about it. Even if it's really scary, I would much rather know than have that thing come up and take over. And because I'm not aware of it, I assume that's me. I identify with it, right? That's the worst thing we can do. All right, so humility. To me, this leads to compassion. Okay, compassion for ourselves, compassion for others. When we really are willing to see those shadows, the darkness, then we really can be like, okay, yeah, if someone else is having a hard time, right? Like, let's say our spouse never takes out the trash, right? And we tell them whenever, every Wednesday, take out the trash. How many times did I tell you? You got to take out the trash, blah, blah, blah. I tell you, you don't love me. You don't listen to me, right? All this stuff that we're saying. Well, when we see those parts of ourselves that we can't change, even though we'd like to change them. And you can try it. Try and change those things. See what you can do. Some things just fall away, right? The minute you see them, it's like popping a bubble. You see some pattern, habit pattern in your unconscious, you're like, why do I do that? That's annoying. And then it's gone. That's beautiful. And very often when we start this work, we have a few of those early on, like really easy, bang, bang, bang. Wow, I'm becoming such a good person, right? It's exciting. Wow, look at me. Then some of the other ones, it feels like they're never going to go away. And to be honest, they may not in this lifetime. But it doesn't mean that doing the work isn't rewarding. So it isn't all goal-oriented, right? It isn't about, again, becoming some kind of saintly, perfect person. That you may never get there. But you will get closer than you will without doing the work. And the reason you want to do that is not so that other people are like, oh my God, you're so saintly, look at you. It's because of the way you feel inside. Again, all of this advice is for you to live a more joyful and happy life. I have very little interest in, talking about ethics or morals or what it means to be a good person, because I've studied that stuff in college and in high school a lot, and there's no clear answer as far as I'm concerned, okay? There's no clear answer. All the different religions, they have maybe similar teachings, but they're not the same. And it's those little differences often where people are willing to kill one another over those differences. So if you think, I had a friend who said that, basically all the traditions teach this. No, they don't. They don't all teach the same thing. Okay, there's some overlap. There's a lot of small differences and some big differences. And those differences are usually the things that people go to war over, kill one another over. So don't try and, gloss over that. Those differences are the big differences to the people that believe that they're important. Okay? So we can't all agree. We don't all agree on that. That's very, very important. All right, so I want to move on to another thing, which is the cross, the symbol of the cross. Okay, again, I'm talking about Christianity as a myth. And so the cross for me, it really symbolizes, I had a friend who was pointing out wow, if Jesus came back, he'd be terrified because the symbol of his trauma is everywhere, right? All the Christian churches have the cross up, And you might think, what a strange thing to use. This was a torture device. This was a torture device in which the Savior, the teacher of the Christian tradition, the main founder, was killed on. Doesn't that seem like a odd thing, a symbol to use to represent your whole tradition and religion? Well, for me, it makes perfect sense, because what is being imparted with that symbol is that it's through our suffering that we grow spiritually and we reach salvation, we reach heaven, we reach God. It's not by avoiding it or running away from it. So the cross is the symbol of the crucifixion. It's the symbol of, again, our suffering as human beings. And Jesus had several opportunities. Some of them are documented in the Bible, and then I've also read other accounts that said that basically Jesus could have escaped very, very easily, several times. Now, again, fact, fiction, I don't know. I'm not a scholar. I'm not really interested in debating. But the same was true of Socrates. Okay, I don't know if you know this, but Socrates was also killed, executed by the state, just like Jesus. Okay, so our Western teachers aren't doing so hot. We like to put them to death. We don't make them into great saints. We do that after they're dead, right? We kill them off first, and then we start to study them. So Socrates was sentenced to death by hemlock. And back then, when they sentenced you to death in Greece, they just assumed you would leave town, and that's what they wanted. They just wanted him out of there. He was a troublemaker, just like Jesus, right? This guy's a troublemaker. Get him out of our hair. The powers that be, right? We don't want this troublemaker. He's making people question things. We don't want that. We want people just single file, follow along. So they sentenced him to death. His followers, Socrates' followers, came to him and said, okay, let's get out of here. Because that's what everyone did. And he was like, no, I can't do that. And he gave a whole teaching about being a citizen of Athens and honoring, what Athens had to say on the matter. So he was sentenced to death. He was going to die as part of his duty, part of his, duty to Athens. He also said that he knew what life had brought him, and he was curious about what death would be. Death was the next thing. He already kind of experienced everything that life had to be, so he was curious about death. This is a very awake way to die. Same, again, is rumored, at least, about Jesus. Jesus could have gotten out of there. He again, if you look at his exchange with Pontius Pilate, it seems like Pontius doesn't really want to execute him. He's sort of asking questions. Then people like, kill him, crucify him. And he's like, I don't think he's really guilty. I think we maybe should let this guy go. But Jesus doesn't lift a finger in his own defense. He basically is like, hey, whatever. So this again is, he's not running away from suffering, from hardship, from the crucifixion. He's basically willing to go right into that experience. Now again, why would we do this? Because most of us spend most of our life trying to run away from pain, suffering, difficulty. Well, again, this is what leads to our enlightenment, to our awakening, to our spiritual growth. Now, I'm not saying you need to go get hung up on a cross in order to grow spiritually. The fact is, each of our lives have suffering built in. This was the Buddha's teaching. All life is suffering. This wasn't a invention of his. People hear that and they're like, well, I don't like Buddhism. It's so pessimistic. That's just a fact, folks. Life is suffering. It is built in. There is just pain in it, okay? Can't escape it. It's not pessimistic. It's just realistic, all right? It's just the way it is. Some lives seem to have more pain than others. And we are learning different lessons through that if we know we're in school. So one of the mistakes we make in this life is we think hedonistically. We think, oh, here I am with this body, and oh, so I just need to get as much pleasure as I can. I like money, I like sex, I like coffee, I like wine, I like drugs, I like partying, like having fun. So I need to maximize those things. And then things like pain, suffering, death, illness, just need to minimize those things. And then I'm going to get as much as I can out of this life. And eventually I'm going to die. And that was the point of my life, is to maximize those fun things and to minimize the painful things. Well, when we really get serious about spirituality, we stop seeing it that way. It doesn't mean that we run after pain. That's not what I'm telling you to do. Pain will come. You don't have to run after it. Pain will come. And so our attitude when pain comes. So the pandemic, great example. What is your relationship with the current pandemic? Are you just waiting for it to be over? Have you learned anything through this about yourself? What is your relationship with suffering, with pain, with death, with difficulty? These things are not optional, folks. They are built into the fabric of life, and they're built in for a reason, because it is through them that we grow and learn. This is the mud at the bottom of the pool. That is the mud in which the lotus flower grows up. Okay? So, we can't eliminate them. It is just not possible. I'm not saying, again, we need to seek them out. We can try and minimize suffering and pain, but it's just part of the equation, because it's part of how we grow as human beings. All right? So again, the cross represents that. And we see in Christianity, that is the symbol. That is held high. We're not trying to escape it. Now, I'm not saying Christians see it this way. I'd say probably most Christians don't. They don't maybe understand why the cross. And I'm sure there are other reasons that it's used as well. I'm not saying this is the only reason, but this is one way to interpret or understand that symbology. So the crucifixion and the resurrection are the pinnacle of Jesus' teaching. You might think that Jesus taught, in his parables, and then, he died and was resurrected. But his death and resurrection are part of his teaching. Okay? Again, whether that factually happened or not, lots of debate about that. Not important as far as I'm concerned, because the whole myth is a part of the teaching, right? So in the myth, he died and then was resurrected. Okay? So the myth and of the resurrection demonstrates that death, as we think of it, is not really real. Right? If Jesus could die, and by all accounts he was dead, and then come back, well, then death must not be what we really think. It must not be an end in the way that we tend to think of it. Okay? And the path to everlasting life, right, or the kingdom of heaven, or whatever you want to call it, nirvana, if you're talking about Buddhism, is by way of the cross, is by way of our suffering. Okay? So, very powerful teachings there, as far as I'm concerned. And again, for me, Jesus is an incredible teacher and very much misunderstood teacher. There's a lot in the Christian tradition that I get a lot from it in my own teaching, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. But again, I'd say my readings and my understandings of those teachings are perhaps quite different than your average person's understanding of them. And I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong, but as I said right at the beginning of our discussion today, it's impossible not to interpret. So I don't even know if there could ever be a correct interpretation. Who would decide that? It's kind of the same thing as, a perfect person. Has there ever been a perfect person on this planet? Who Who can everyone agree on is perfect? I posted an article a few months back about Gandhi. Many people look up to Gandhi. Well, this article was criticizing him. Martin Luther King, many people look up to him. Others criticize him. Some people who in India have been held up as saints, certain gurus who are well respected. Later it comes out, that there was some transgression, some controversy around things that they did, things like that. I think very often when we think someone is perfect, again, it usually means we don't have all the facts and information. And one of these days I'd like to give a talk or maybe write something about a topic that I've been thinking about for a while. I'm not going to get too much into it today, but it's basically the saint, the sinner, and the sage. And those of you who have been following my teaching for a while know about yin and yang, the pairs of opposites. And in the Tao Te Ching, it says that, more or less, I'm paraphrasing, but it says if you want to get rid of sinners, then you have to get rid of the saint. If you want to get rid of sinners, then you have to get rid of the saint. You can't hold someone up as perfect and not at the same time create something that is imperfect. And in that, I'm going to say that neither of those are perfect. They're really two sides of one thing. For me, what I'm going to call sage transcends that duality. And that's what I want to teach you, and that's what I want to teach you, to be the sage, to have that outlook that transcends that idea of right, wrong, good and bad. We're trying to be perfect people. Because as far as I'm concerned, a perfect person isn't perfect. There's no such thing. Again, if you're a Christian, you might think Jesus is perfect. Well, let's go to China and ask them how perfect they think he is. Not Christian people, just normal people. Okay? There just isn't anybody. Mother Teresa, I don't care who you pick. Someone can always criticize. We didn't live with these people, right? A lot of these myths and these saints come from a time before we had all the information we have today. That's why I think we have so few of these perfect people these days. There always seems to be a story that comes out that just ruins the myth in the making. Oh, well, they were actually a, child abuser, or they were actually, an awful parent, they beat their kids, whatever it is. We find out something, we're like, oh God, I thought they were really, saintly, but I guess not. So anyway, guys, happy Easter. Thank you for listening. I'm going to put this up on the Patreon page as usual. Again, if you want to help support me, I'm basically out of work at the moment. Government keeps threatening to send me money, and but so far haven't seen any of that. There's some links, like a one-time donation. You become a Patreon on the page. And again, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is availing yourself of these tools. So if you get something out of this and you don't have a lot of money, don't worry about it. Go to the Patreon page, and there's tons of free content that I'm posting during the pandemic. Okay? And that's for you to use. That's for you to share with people who can use it. I'm posting about breathing techniques, whole yoga classes, these kinds of talks, meditation, yoga nidra, really everything that I can think of, chanting, all of that is up there for you. Okay, so please take advantage of those things. That makes me happiest when you do that. Of course, if you've got work, if you got money coming in, you can help support me and this community. You help people who can't afford to do that, right? If you're not able to give anything, you can contribute, then it means that they don't have to. All right, namaste, everyone. Thank you so much. Maybe we'll be back next Sunday for another talk. I'm not sure yet. We'll have to see what I come up with. If there are any questions, hit me up on Facebook. You can go to my website, send me a note there. You can send me notes on Patreon. Lots of different ways to get in touch with me. Okay? So Jai Bhagwan, may the spirit be victorious. Thank you all for listening. Good night.